I've never had a job that I actually enjoyed going to. I think most people can relate to that. But the summer after my sophomore year of college, I got close. I was working as a docent at this old lighthouse museum about 45 minutes from campus. If you don't know what a docent is, it's basically a fancy word for a tour guide who pretends to know more than they actually do. The lighthouse was on this narrow peninsula that jutted out into the Atlantic. The drive to get there was honestly one of my favorite parts. You'd take this 2-lane road that wound through some marshland, and then it narrowed into basically a single-lane path with water on both sides for the last quarter mile. During high tide, you could see the water lapping at the edges of the road. It was beautiful during the day. At night, I imagine it would feel like driving into the ocean. I never planned on finding out firsthand. The pay was terrible. I think I was making like $11 an hour, which even back then was barely enough to cover gas and ramen. But the job itself was easy. I'd show up around 9 in the morning, unlock the place, and maybe get 15 to 20 visitors throughout the day. Most of them were older couples or families with bored kids. I'd give my little spiel about the history of the lighthouse, how it was built in 1847, decommissioned in 1991, all that stuff. I had it memorized after the first week. The lighthouse itself was one of those classic New England towers, white with a red top about 80 feet tall, iron spiral staircase inside that went all the way up to the lantern room. The light was still up there, this massive Fresnel lens that looked like a giant glass beehive. It hadn't been turned on in over 30 years, but they kept it polished and pretty for the tourists. There was a small keeper's house attached to the base that served as the museum and gift shop. That's where I spent most of my time. I should mention that my car at this point in my life was a disaster. It was a 2003 Honda Civic that I bought for my uncle for $1,500, and I'm pretty sure he ripped me off. The thing had over 200,000 miles on it. The check engine light had been on so long that I forgot it was even there. It would make this grinding noise when I turned left, and about once a month it would just decide not to start. Usually it would start on the second or third try. I kept telling myself I'd get it looked at, but I never did because I couldn't afford it. You can probably see where this is going. It was a Thursday in late July. I remember it being Thursday because that was usually my slowest day. I think I had maybe 6 visitors the entire day. The museum closed at 5, and I did my usual routine. Locked the display cases, counted the register, swept the floors, turned off the lights. I walked out to my car around 5:30, tossed my backpack in the passenger seat, and turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click. I tried again. Nothing. I wasn't panicking yet because this had happened before. I waited about 30 seconds, tried again. Dead. I popped the hood even though I had absolutely no idea what I was looking at. Everything looked the same as it always did to me, which meant nothing because I wouldn't know a bad alternator from a carburetor. I pulled out my phone to call my roommate, Jake. He knew a little about cars and had jumper cables. When I looked at my phone, I had 8% battery. I hadn't charged it all day because I forgot my charger at the apartment. I called Jake and it went straight to voicemail. He was probably in class. I tried my friend Megan. Voicemail. I tried my mom, who lived 3 hours away and couldn't help anyway, and she actually picked up. I told her my car wouldn't start and I was stuck at work. She told me to call AAA. I told her I didn't have AAA. She told me I should get AAA. Real helpful, Mom. While I was talking to her, my phone hit 5%. I told her I'd figure it out and that I'd call her later. Then I tried Jake one more time. Voicemail again. My phone was at 3%. I turned it off to preserve whatever battery I had left in case I really needed it. I figured someone would realize I wasn't home eventually, or I could try again in a little while. I wasn't worried yet. Annoyed, sure, but not worried. It was still light out. It was summer. The sun wouldn't set until almost 8:30. I had time. I thought about walking. The issue with walking was that the nearest town was about 7 miles away if you followed the main road. But first, I'd have to walk that quarter-mile stretch across the peninsula road, then another 6 or so miles through the marshland with no sidewalk. I'd done the drive enough times to know there wasn't much between the lighthouse and town. A few scattered houses maybe, but I couldn't remember exactly where they were. I decided to wait it out. Maybe the car needed to cool down or something. I don't know. I was grasping at straws. I went back inside the museum to sit in the air conditioning and wait. I figured I'd try the car again in an hour. If it still didn't work, I'd turn on my phone, call someone, and deal with the dying battery situation then. I sat in the gift shop area reading one of the books we sold about local maritime history. Actually a pretty interesting read. I learned more from that book than I ever did from the employee training packet. About an hour passed and I went back outside to try the car. Still dead. Completely dead. At this point, the sun was getting lower. I'd say it was around 7. I was starting to get a little anxious and I turned my phone on. 3% somehow hadn't changed. I called Jake. It rang this time, which got my hopes up. But then it went to voicemail again. I started to text him, but my phone died mid-text. I watched the screen go black and felt my stomach drop a little. Okay. So I was stuck. No working car, no working phone. No one knew I was still here. The next person scheduled to work was Diane, the other docent, and she didn't come in until Saturday. That was 2 days away. I wasn't about to wait 2 days. I decided I would wait until morning. It was already getting close to sunset, and walking 7 miles on a road with no street lights and no sidewalk in the dark seemed stupider than just sleeping in the museum. I had the keys. There was a bathroom with running water. There was a couch in the back office that Diane sometimes napped on during slow days. It wasn't ideal, but it was fine. I'd get up early, walk to town first thing in the morning, and figure out the car situation from there. I locked up the museum from the inside and settled into the back office. I ate a granola bar I had in my backpack and drank some water from the bathroom sink. I scrolled through one of the books for a while. As the sun set, the building got dark fast. There were only a few small windows in the keeper's house, and they didn't let in much light once the sun dropped below the tree line. I turned on the desk lamp in the office. At least the electricity still worked. I should have just gone to sleep. That would have been the smart thing to do. But I was restless and a little bit wired from the anxiety of the situation. I decided to walk around the museum a bit. I don't know why. Maybe I was just bored. Maybe I thought pacing would tire me out. I walked through the display rooms looking at all the artifacts I'd seen 1,000 times. Old photographs of keepers and their families, rusty tools, a logbook from 1923 that was open behind glass. I'd given tours past these things all summer without really looking at them. Now, in the dark with just the ambient light from the office lamp bleeding through the doorway, they felt different. Not scary exactly, just weighted, like the building felt heavier at night. It was around 9:30 when I first noticed it. I was standing in the main display room, and I could see the base of the lighthouse tower through the connecting doorway. The spiral staircase started right there. During the day, visitors could climb about halfway up before a chain, and a sign stopped them. The upper portion was off limits due to structural concerns, according to my manager, though I'd never actually seen any damage up there. I was looking at the staircase, and I noticed a faint glow coming from somewhere above. Very faint, almost like moonlight hitting something reflective. But the light was coming from inside the tower, not through a window. At least, that's what it looked like. I walked closer to the base of the stairs and looked up. The staircase wound up in a tight spiral, so you couldn't see very far, even in daylight. At night, you could barely see past the first curve. But there was definitely a light up there. A dim, warm, amber glow. My first thought was that I'd left a light on. Maybe there was a light fixture somewhere on the upper levels that I'd accidentally switched on at some point. I didn't think I'd been up there that day, but maybe I had and forgot. I'd been working there all summer, and some days blurred together. I almost went up to turn it off, but I stopped at the chain. Something about the way the light looked made me pause. It wasn't a steady electric light. It pulsed. Very slowly, very faintly, but it definitely pulsed, like a heartbeat. That's what I thought of immediately, and I wished I hadn't. It looked like the light was breathing. I stood there for probably 2 minutes just watching it. Then I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably a reflection from something outside, a car passing on a distant road, headlights catching the lens up top. That was the logical explanation. The Fresnel lens was designed to magnify and redirect light. Even a small light source from far away could potentially create a glow if it hit the lens at the right angle. I went back to the office, convinced myself it was nothing, and lay down on the couch. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. My mind was doing that thing where it won't shut off. I kept thinking about the car, about how I'd get to town in the morning, about how much a tow truck would cost that I couldn't afford. Normal anxiety stuff. About 45 minutes later, I got up to use the bathroom. On my way back to the office, I passed the doorway to the tower again. I glanced up without really thinking about it. The light was brighter, noticeably brighter. Still that warm amber color, still pulsing slowly but brighter than before, like someone had turned a dimmer switch up a few notches. I stood there staring up into the spiral. My heart rate picked up, but I was still telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe clouds had shifted outside and more moonlight was hitting the lens. Maybe there was some kind of electrical issue, and the emergency lighting in the tower had kicked on. I didn't even know if there was emergency lighting in the tower. I didn't think there was. As I was standing there, I heard something, a sound from up in the tower. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but in the dead silence of that building at night, I heard it. A metallic sound, like something tapping against the iron railing of the staircase. Tap, 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 rhythmic, slow, getting very slightly louder. I took a step back from the doorway. The tapping continued. It sounded like it was coming from maybe halfway up the tower, which was already past the chain, which meant it was in the section that was supposed to be empty and off limits. I want to be clear about something. In that moment, I was not thinking about ghosts or anything supernatural. I was thinking about a person. I was thinking that someone else was in this lighthouse with me, someone who had maybe been hiding in the upper section all day. That thought was almost worse than a ghost, honestly. The idea that a real person had been up there while I was giving tours, while visitors were climbing halfway up, while I was sitting alone reading in the office. A real person hiding and waiting. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I backed away from the tower entrance and went into the office. I closed the door. There was no lock on it, which I had never thought about before that moment, but suddenly felt like a massive oversight. I sat on the couch and listened. Nothing. For about 20 minutes I heard absolutely nothing. I started to calm down. I started to convince myself that I'd imagined the tapping, that it was the building settling, that old iron structures make noise when they cool down at night. That made sense. Metal expands in heat and contracts in cold. The tower had been baking in the sun all day, and now it was cooling. That could absolutely make tapping sounds. The light was harder to explain away, but I was working on it. By 11, I had almost convinced myself everything was fine. I was lying on the couch with my eyes closed, not sleeping but trying to, when I heard something that I could not explain away. Footsteps on the spiral staircase. Metal footsteps like shoes on iron going up. Not down, up, slow and deliberate, one step at a time, with a pause between each one. Like someone was climbing carefully, feeling for each stair in the dark. I sat up so fast I almost fell off the couch. I was frozen, just sitting there on the edge of the couch, listening. Step, pause, step, pause, step, pause, each one echoing faintly through the stone structure of the lighthouse. They were going up. Whatever it was going up, not coming toward me. I don't know why that distinction mattered to me so much in the moment, but it did. It was going away from me, toward the light. I should have left. I know that. I should have gone right out the front door of the museum and started walking down that road in the dark, and I would have taken my chances with the 7-mile walk in the pitch-black marshland, but I didn't leave. I think part of me was paralyzed, and part of me had this idiotic curiosity, this need to understand what I was hearing. I crept to the office door and opened it slowly. I stepped out into the display room. From there, I could see the base of the tower stairs through the connecting doorway. The amber light from above was even brighter now. It was casting a visible glow on the lower portion of the staircase, painting the iron steps in this warm golden color. And the footsteps continued. Step, pause, higher and higher. I walked to the base of the stairs and looked up. I couldn't see anyone. The spiral hid everything beyond the first turn. But the footsteps were clear, real, undeniable, a person's weight on iron stairs. I could feel the faintest vibration through the floor. Then the footsteps stopped. I stood there, tilted back, staring up into the golden spiral. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The light pulsed silently above. I counted to 60 in my head, then to 60 again. Nothing happened. Then, from somewhere near the top of the tower, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. It was a grinding sound, heavy, mechanical, like gears engaging after decades of disuse, like something massive and metal beginning to turn. The light brightened significantly, and then it moved. It swept, like a beam. I saw the glow shift from one direction to another, rotating slowly, and I realized with a sickening clarity that the light at the top of this decommissioned lighthouse had just turned on. The actual light. The Fresnel lens was rotating. I could hear it. That deep, grinding mechanical rotation. The decommissioned, unpowered, disconnected for 30 years light was spinning. I ran. I didn't go toward the tower. I went straight for the front door of the museum. I unlocked it, threw it open, and I ran out into the night. I didn't even close the door behind me. I sprinted past my dead car and down the gravel path toward the Peninsula Road. I ran in the dark, which I said earlier I didn't want to do. But terror has a way of making bad options feel perfectly reasonable. While I was running, I looked back over my shoulder. The lighthouse beam was sweeping the landscape, cutting through the dark in a slow, steady rotation, just like it must have done for 150 years when it was operational, lighting up the marsh grass and the water and the road in a rhythmic pulse. As the beam swept past me, I swear the air got warm, just for a second, like standing near an open oven, then cold again. I ran the entire quarter-mile stretch of the Peninsula Road. I could feel the water on either side, even though I couldn't see it well. When I reached the main road, I kept running. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like concrete. I finally stopped about a mile from the lighthouse, hands on my knees, gasping. I looked back. I could still see the beam, still sweeping, still turning. I walked the rest of the way to town. It took me until almost 1 in the morning. I found a 24-hour gas station and used their phone to call Jake. He was confused and half asleep, but he came to get me. I told him my car broke down. I didn't tell him about the light. I didn't tell him about the footsteps. I didn't know how to say it without sounding insane. When I went back the next day with Jake and jumper cables, the lighthouse looked perfectly normal. The light was off, the museum was still unlocked with the front door wide open, which I felt terrible about. Nothing inside was disturbed. I went to the base of the tower stairs and looked up. No glow, no sound. Just a dark, quiet staircase disappearing into shadow. I climbed the stairs, past the chain, all the way up to the lantern room. The Fresnel lens sat there, perfectly still, covered in 30 years of dust. Except it wasn't. That's the part that still haunts me. The lens itself, this massive glass and brass assembly, was polished where it sits in its track, like something had been turning it. And in the dust on the iron platform around it, there were marks. Not footprints exactly, more like drag marks, in a circle, like something had been walking around and around the lens. I quit that job 2 days later. I told my manager I found something that paid better. She didn't ask questions. I never went back to that lighthouse. But here's what I can't stop thinking about. About a week after all this happened, I was in the campus library and I looked up the history of the lighthouse. Not the tourist history I'd been reciting all summer, but the real history, the detailed records. 3 keepers died in that lighthouse between 1847 and 1991. 2 of them died in the lantern room. 1 fell from the exterior walkway. The other was found dead at the base of the lens, and the official cause of death was listed as heart failure. He was 34 years old. The 3rd keeper disappeared entirely. His name was William Harding, and in November of 1987, 4 years before the lighthouse was decommissioned, he simply vanished. His car was still in the lot. His dinner was still on the stove in the keeper's house. He was never found. The light was operational the night he disappeared. Coast Guard records show it was functioning normally. But the logbook, the actual keeper's logbook, had one final entry in his hand. It said, "It's climbing again. The light wants company." I don't know what that means. I don't know what I heard or what turned that light on, but I know what I saw in the dust up there. And I know that light hadn't been powered in 30 years. And I know that whatever was on those stairs that night was going up, toward the light, like it always had been. I don't go near lighthouses anymore. I don't even like looking at them in pictures. My girlfriend thinks I'm being dramatic, and maybe I am. But she didn't hear those footsteps. She didn't feel that beam go warm when it passed over her. Some things change you in a way that you can't explain to other people, and this is one of those things for me. I just hope whatever is in that tower stays in that tower, because the thought that it could come down those stairs is something I try very hard not to think about. I should probably mention that this experience happened because my girlfriend at the time, Rachel, was the kind of person who saw a sign for a scenic overlook and had to stop. Every single time. I love that about her usually, but on this particular day, it's what got us into trouble. We were about 6 months into dating, and we decided to take a road trip down the coast. We lived in Connecticut and drove all the way down through Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and up into Maine. We had a loose plan. A few hotels booked, a few restaurants we wanted to try, but mostly we were winging it. That was our style back then. We were both 25, no kids, flexible schedules. Life was good. We were somewhere along the Maine coast, maybe an hour north of Portland. I can't be more specific than that because, honestly, I'm not totally sure exactly where we were. We'd been driving on this scenic route that wound along the coastline. It was gorgeous. Rocky cliffs, dark blue water, pine trees right up to the edge. It looked like a postcard. Rachel spotted the lighthouse first. It was off to our right, sitting on a small point that jutted out into the ocean. You could see it from the road, barely. Just the top of it peeking above the tree line. She grabbed my arm and said we had to go check it out. There was a small gravel turnoff that led to what looked like an access road. No signs, no gate, no indication of whether it was public or private. I hesitated for a second, but Rachel was already unbuckling her seatbelt practically. I turned onto the gravel road. It was narrow and winding, leading through thick pine forest and gradually downhill toward the coast. After about half a mile, the trees opened up and we could see the lighthouse clearly. It was sitting on this rocky point, maybe 200 yards from where the gravel road ended in a small dirt lot. There was no fence, no ticket booth, no nothing. Just the lighthouse and a small concrete building at its base that might have been a storage shed or an old keeper's quarters. The lighthouse itself looked old, but not quite abandoned. The white paint was peeling in places, and some of the windows on the attached building were boarded up. But the structure seemed solid. It was maybe 60 feet tall, definitely a working lighthouse at some point, though I couldn't tell if it was still active. We parked and got out. The air smelled like salt and pine. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below was constant. This low rhythmic boom that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. It was early afternoon, maybe 1 or 2. The sky was overcast but not threatening, standard Maine coastal weather. We walked around the lighthouse, took some pictures, tried the door on the attached building. It was unlocked. Rachel looked at me with that look she got when she wanted to do something she knew she probably shouldn't. I shrugged. We went inside. The building was essentially one room, old concrete floors, a wooden workbench along one wall, some rusted equipment I didn't recognize. There was a doorway that led into the base of the lighthouse tower itself. The circular staircase was right there, iron and rusting but seemingly solid. We went up about halfway, took more pictures, and came back down. It was cool, nothing remarkable, just an old lighthouse. We were about to leave when I noticed the sky. It had changed dramatically in the 20 minutes we'd been exploring. The overcast gray had turned into something much darker, almost greenish, the kind of sky that makes you instinctively look for cover. I told Rachel we should probably get going. She agreed. We walked quickly back to the car and I started driving back up the gravel access road. We got about a quarter mile before I saw it. The road ahead was flooding. Water was rushing across the gravel from the left side, coming from higher ground. It wasn't deep yet, maybe a few inches, but it was moving fast and the volume was increasing visibly. I stopped the car. I've never been great at making split-second decisions. I tend to freeze and overthink. This was one of those moments. I sat there for probably 30 seconds trying to decide if I should try to drive through it or turn around. In those 30 seconds, the water went from a few inches to what looked like almost a foot. Then the rain hit. Not regular rain, the kind of rain that makes you question if the sky broke open. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I couldn't see 20 feet in front of the car. The water on the road was rising fast. I made the decision to turn around. Going forward through rising water in a sedan seemed like a death wish. I turned the car around carefully on the narrow road and drove back toward the lighthouse. By the time we got back to the dirt lot, the rain was coming down so hard that we could barely hear each other talk. We sat in the car for about 10 minutes hoping it would pass. It didn't. If anything, it got worse. Rachel pulled up the weather on her phone. Flash flood warning. The entire area was under a flash flood warning that had apparently been issued while we were climbing the lighthouse. The gravel access road sat in a low point between two ridges, and all the runoff from both sides funneled right across it. We weren't going anywhere for a while. The road back was completely impassable now. We could see from the lot that the section near the tree line was underwater, easily 2 feet deep and rushing. Rachel said we should wait in the lighthouse building rather than the car, in case the lot flooded too. That made sense. We ran from the car to the building, getting absolutely soaked in the 30 seconds it took. Once inside, we caught our breath and laughed about it. At first, it felt like an adventure, a funny story we'd tell later. Stranded at a lighthouse in Maine during a flash flood. How romantic. We settled in. Rachel sat on the old workbench. I leaned against the wall. The rain hammered on the roof so loud it was almost like white noise after a while. We talked about whether we should call someone, but neither of us really knew who to call or what they could do. It wasn't like we were in danger. We were in a solid concrete building above the waterline. We just had to wait it out. It was probably around 3 in the afternoon at this point. After about an hour of waiting, the rain hadn't let up at all. Rachel was getting bored and suggested we explore the lighthouse more thoroughly since we had nothing else to do. I agreed. We went back into the tower and climbed higher this time, all the way to the top. The lantern room was small and circular, mostly glass panels around the sides, with the old light mechanism in the center. The glass was dirty, but you could still see out. The view in the storm was actually incredible. Gray ocean churning, waves smashing the rocks, sheets of rain sweeping across the water. We spent a while up there just watching the storm, then we went back down. And that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a door on the ground floor that I had initially thought was a closet. It was on the far side of the main room, partially hidden behind a stack of old wooden crates. When we'd first come in, I hadn't given it a second look. But now, sitting there with nothing to do, I was looking at everything more carefully. The door was slightly ajar, maybe half an inch. I wouldn't have noticed it at all except a faint draft was coming from behind it, and it was moving the cobwebs near the frame, just barely. I pointed it out to Rachel. She said it was probably just a storage closet or maybe access to a crawl space. That made sense. But the draft bothered me. Where was air coming from behind a closed door in a concrete building? I walked over and pulled the door open. It wasn't a closet. There were stairs going down, narrow concrete stairs descending into darkness. A basement or cellar of some kind that we didn't know existed. Neither of us had a flashlight, but our phone still had battery. Rachel turned on her phone light and pointed it down the stairs. They went down about 10 feet and opened into what looked like another room below. The air coming up smelled damp and earthy, like a root cellar. Also something else. Something I couldn't quite identify but didn't like. Kind of sweet. Kind of rotten. I told Rachel I didn't think we should go down there. She agreed surprisingly fast, which told me she smelled it too. I closed the door and moved one of the crates in front of it. Not blocking it exactly, but enough that I'd hear it if it moved. That was the first moment I felt genuinely uneasy. We went back to our spots and waited. The rain continued. It was getting darker outside as the afternoon moved toward evening. The clouds were so thick that it felt like night was coming early. Around 5 or 6, I'm not exactly sure because I was trying to save my phone battery and had stopped checking. Rachel said something that made my stomach flip. She said she smelled something different. Not the basement smell, something else. She said it smelled like cigarette smoke. I sniffed the air. At first I didn't smell anything except the general mustiness of the building and the rain. But then, faintly, I caught it. Just a whisper of it. Old cigarette smoke. Like it was trapped in the walls or something. I told Rachel it was probably just the building. Old buildings smell like that sometimes, especially ones where people used to live and smoke. She accepted that. I'm not sure I did, but I said it anyway. About 30 minutes later, I noticed something that I really wish I hadn't. The crate I'd moved in front of the basement door had shifted. Not by a lot, maybe 2 inches, but I had pushed it flush against the door. I was certain of that. And now there was a gap. I stared at it for a long time without saying anything to Rachel. I was running through explanations. The floor was uneven and maybe it had slid. The building vibrated from the storm and it shifted. I bumped it at some point and didn't notice. All possible, all reasonable. I got up and pushed the crate back against the door. This time I pushed it harder, wedging it tight. I sat back down. Rachel asked what I was doing, and I told her I was just making sure the draft didn't blow the door open. She seemed to accept that. The next hour was quiet. The rain started to ease slightly. Not stopping, but the intensity dropped from violent to merely heavy. I was starting to think we might be able to leave soon. Then I heard it, from below us, from the basement. A single heavy thud. Rachel heard it too. I know she did because she straightened up on the workbench and looked directly at me. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. We just looked at each other with that silent communication that couples develop. Her eyes were asking me if I heard what she heard. Mine were confirming it. I told her it was probably something falling over, an old shelf giving way, a piece of equipment toppling from water seepage. Basements in coastal buildings flood all the time, and things get knocked around. I was saying all of this with full confidence, and I almost believed it myself. Almost. Rachel nodded slowly, but she didn't take her eyes off the door. Neither did I. We sat there in silence for probably 5 minutes, just watching the door, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. The rain continued its steady drumming. The wind pushed against the building in gusts that made the walls creak. Normal storm sounds. I started to relax again. Then there was another thud. This one was different. The first one had been a single heavy impact, like something falling. This one was more of a bang, sharper, more deliberate, and it was followed by a second one. Bang, pause, bang. Rachel slid off the workbench and came to stand next to me. She grabbed my arm and squeezed hard. I could feel her fingernails through my jacket. I whispered to her that it was probably the storm causing pressure changes in the building. Doors slamming from wind drafts, that kind of thing. Even as I said it, I knew it didn't quite work. The sounds were coming from below us, from a basement that had only one entrance, an entrance that had a crate pushed against it. The sounds stopped again. This time the silence lasted longer, maybe 10 minutes. I started to genuinely consider our options. The rain had eased up a bit, but it was still coming down steadily. The access road was probably still flooded. Even if it wasn't, I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through the woods in the dark during a storm, but I was also increasingly not sure I wanted to stay in this building. I whispered to Rachel that maybe we should go sit in the car. At least the car had locks. She shook her head. She said the car was 50 feet away and we'd have to go outside in the dark. I looked toward the building's front door. It was closed but not locked. Outside was pitch black now. The cloud cover and rain made it so dark that I couldn't see anything through the small window near the door. The lighthouse tower was completely dark above us. No ambient light from anywhere. I turned on my phone light and pointed it around the room. Everything looked normal. The crate was still against the door. Nothing had moved. I turned the light off to save battery. That's when Rachel froze. She squeezed my arm even harder and whispered so quietly I could barely hear her. She said there was a light coming from under the door. I looked. She was right. A faint yellowish light was visible in the thin gap between the bottom of the basement door and the floor. It was dim and slightly flickering, like a candle or a flame. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was some stupid masculine instinct to protect my girlfriend, or maybe it was that same idiotic curiosity that almost got the first narrator in trouble. But I moved toward the door. Rachel grabbed my shirt and pulled me back. She told me not to open it. She said we should leave. Right now. She was right. I know she was right. But I didn't listen. Not because I was brave. I think it was because some part of my brain needed to know that there was a rational explanation. I needed to confirm that it was a broken pipe and a reflected beam of light from somewhere, or an electrical short causing a spark, or literally anything that made sense. Because if I walked out of that building without looking, I would spend the rest of my life wondering. I moved the crate away from the door. The light got slightly brighter in the gap at the bottom. I could hear Rachel breathing fast behind me. I put my hand on the door handle. It was cold, not just cool, but noticeably cold, like metal that had been in a refrigerator. I pulled the door open slowly. The light was coming from the bottom of the stairs. I could see it illuminating the concrete steps, casting long shadows up toward me. It was definitely flame. The flickering was unmistakable. Someone had a candle or a lantern lit in the basement of this lighthouse. I leaned forward and looked down the stairs. What I saw made my entire body go rigid. At the bottom of the stairs, maybe 10 feet below me, was a small room. Concrete walls, low ceiling, and in that room, illuminated by 2 small candles on the floor, was a living space. A sleeping bag was rolled out against the far wall. Next to it was a small pile of clothes. There were empty cans and food wrappers scattered around. A gallon jug of water half empty. A backpack with things spilling out of it. And on the wall, written in what looked like marker or maybe charcoal, were tally marks, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Grouped in sets of 5, covering a large section of the wall from floor to about head height. Someone was living here. Someone had been living here for a long time based on those tally marks. My brain processed all of this in about 2 seconds. In the 3rd second, I processed something else. The sleeping bag was unzipped and pushed to one side, like someone had recently gotten out of it. The candles were freshly lit, the wax hadn't built up yet, and the person who lived here was not in the room. I backed away from the door so fast I almost knocked Rachel over. I whispered to her what I saw, and I said we need to leave right now. I didn't have to say it twice. We went for the front door of the building. I pushed it open and we stepped out into the rain. It was still coming down, but much lighter now. The darkness was total. I couldn't see the car. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. It swept across the gravel lot and found my car about 50 feet away. We started walking toward it quickly, not running but moving fast. The gravel crunched under our feet. The rain pattered on our jackets. The waves crashed somewhere below to our right. We were about halfway to the car when my phone light swept across something that stopped me dead. There was a person standing at the far edge of the parking lot, just standing there in the rain, facing us. My light hit them and they didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react at all. It was a man. I could tell that much from the build and posture. He was wearing dark clothing, maybe a jacket with the hood up. He was about 40 feet away, just standing in the rain, watching us. Rachel saw him at the same time I did. She let out this sharp breath, almost a gasp, but she cut it short. I kept my phone light on him. He still didn't move. We stood there in this bizarre standoff for what felt like an eternity, but was probably 5 seconds. Then I made a decision. I grabbed Rachel's hand and we walked toward the car. Not toward him, but the car was somewhat in his general direction, since he was at the far edge of the lot and the car was in the middle. I kept my light on him the entire time. He watched us but didn't move. His face was partially obscured by the hood, but from what I could see, he looked like a normal person. Middle-aged, maybe, unremarkable. That almost made it worse. If he had looked deranged or dangerous, it would have confirmed something. Instead, he just looked like a guy standing in the rain at 9 o'clock at night in the middle of nowhere, watching two strangers walk to their car. We reached the car. I unlocked it with the key fob and we practically dove inside. I locked the doors immediately. I started the engine and flipped on the headlights. The headlights illuminated the lot and the edge of the tree line where the access road began. The man was gone. He wasn't at the edge of the lot anymore. I swung the headlights around by turning the car slightly, scanning the area. Nothing. He was just gone. I didn't wait to figure out where he went. I put the car in drive and headed for the access road. The water had receded significantly. It was still wet and there were puddles, but it was passable. I drove through it faster than I probably should have, water spraying up on both sides of the car. We made it to the main road and I turned toward town. Neither of us spoke for probably 10 minutes. Rachel was gripping the door handle so hard her knuckles were white. I was checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see headlights behind us. There were none. Finally, Rachel said something I'll never forget. She said that when we were inside during the last hour before we left, she heard something that she didn't tell me about because she thought she was imagining it. She said that while I was focused on the basement door and the sounds below, she'd been hearing something different, coming from above us, from inside the tower. She said it sounded like someone walking, just slow, quiet footsteps on the spiral staircase above us, going up and then coming back down, over and over, like someone pacing. She didn't tell me because she figured it was the storm or the building settling. But after everything else that happened, she didn't think it was the building. I asked her why she didn't say anything when it was happening. She looked at me and said, because it started before the sounds from the basement. It had been happening since we first sat down after exploring the tower, since the very beginning of us being trapped there. Someone had been above us. Someone had been below us. We were in the middle the entire time. We drove straight to Portland that night. Didn't stop at the hotel we had booked. Didn't stop for anything. We found a different hotel, checked in at midnight and barely slept. We cut the trip short the next morning and drove home. I spent weeks afterward trying to find any information about that lighthouse. I couldn't identify exactly which one it was. I know that sounds crazy, but the Maine coast has dozens of lighthouses, and we were on a scenic route I hadn't mapped. I looked at satellite images. I scrolled through lighthouse databases. I found a few that looked similar, but I couldn't be certain which one it was. Part of me thinks about going back to find it, but a much bigger part of me never wants to see it again. There are a lot of possible explanations: squatters, homeless people using the lighthouse as shelter. Maybe it was just one person living in the basement who went out for a walk and came back to find two strangers in his space. I could see that. That explains most of it. But it doesn't explain the footsteps Rachel heard from the tower. It doesn't explain someone pacing the upper staircase for over an hour while we were right below. It doesn't explain why that person never came down, never confronted us, never made their presence known until we were leaving. And the man in the parking lot, if he was the basement dweller, how did he get outside without passing us? The only exit was through the ground floor where we were sitting, unless there was another way out of that basement that we didn't see. Which means there was another way in. And that makes me think about who else might have access to that space. I try not to think about the tally marks on the wall. I try not to do the math on how long someone would have to live in a basement to fill a wall with marks like that. And I really try not to think about whether those marks were counting days or counting something else entirely. Rachel and I broke up about a year after that trip. Not because of the lighthouse thing, just life going in different directions. But whenever I see her, even now, years later, one of us always brings it up, and it's this thing between us that nobody else quite believes the way we experienced it. People hear the story and they say things like, oh, it was probably just a homeless guy. And yeah, maybe, probably. But they didn't feel what it was like to be trapped in that building, knowing that you weren't alone, knowing that you were sandwiched between two presences that had been watching you the entire time. That feeling doesn't go away just because you find a rational explanation. I grew up fishing. My dad had me on boats before I could walk, practically. We lived in a small town on the coast of North Carolina, and fishing wasn't just a hobby for our family. It was income. My dad ran a charter business during tourist season and did commercial work in the off months. By the time I was 16, I had my own small boat. Nothing fancy, a 19-foot center console with a beat-up Yamaha outboard, but it was mine, and I knew every inch of that water within 20 miles of our dock. I'm telling you this so you understand that what happened to me wasn't because I was careless or inexperienced on the water. I knew what I was doing out there. I had thousands of hours on the ocean by the time this happened. I was 23. This was about 5 years ago now. It was September, which is prime season for false albacore off our coast. If you're not a fisherman, false albacore are these torpedo-shaped fish that show up in big schools and feed on the surface. They're not great eating, but they fight like hell, and they're fun to catch on light tackle. I loved chasing them. On this particular day, I went out alone. That was normal for me. A lot of my fishing was solo, especially during the week when my buddies were working. I launched at dawn from our usual ramp and ran south about 12 miles to where the albies had been showing up. The weather forecast was clean. Light winds, calm seas, clear skies. Perfect conditions. The morning was slow. I saw some birds working a few times but couldn't get on the fish before they disappeared. By mid-morning, I decided to move further offshore, toward a series of rocky shoals that sometimes held fish. These shoals were about 3 miles off the coast, and out past them was an island. I say island loosely. It was more of a big rock with some scrubby vegetation on top, maybe 2 acres total. And on the highest point of this rock sat a lighthouse, old, abandoned, crumbling. It had been out of commission since the 1960s from what I knew. The island had no dock, no easy landing spot, just rocks and rough water around most of it. I'd passed by it hundreds of times but never had any reason to get close. There was a shallow reef around the south side that made it dangerous for boats. I was fishing the shoals with no luck when my engine started acting up. It was surging and losing power, then surging again. I'm not a mechanic, but I know enough to recognize fuel delivery issues. Probably a clogged filter or water in the fuel. I've dealt with it before. Usually you can clear it by running the engine at different RPMs or switching to a secondary fuel filter if you have one. I didn't have a secondary filter on that boat because I was 23 and didn't think ahead about things like that. The engine got progressively worse over about 10 minutes. Then it died completely. I tried to restart it. It would turn over but wouldn't catch. I tried maybe 15 times. Nothing. I was sitting 3 miles offshore in a 19-foot boat with no engine. I wasn't panicking because I had a VHF radio and this was a fairly traveled waterway. I could call for a tow. Expensive, but not life-threatening. I picked up the radio and called on channel 16. Nothing. I tried again. Dead air. I checked the connections. The power light was on, but when I transmitted, I wasn't getting any indication that the signal was going out. I switched channels, tried channel 9, channel 68. Nothing worked. The antenna connection was probably corroded, or the radio had decided to die at the exact same time as my engine, which seemed cosmically unfair. My phone. I pulled it out. I had signal, barely. 1 bar that kept flickering to no service. I tried calling the Marine Tow Service. The call connected, but I could barely hear anything, and they apparently couldn't hear me either. It dropped after about 20 seconds. I tried calling my dad. Same thing. Connected for a moment, his voice cutting in and out, then dropped. I couldn't even send a text. The signal was just too weak, so there I was. No engine, no radio, no phone. 3 miles offshore. I had an anchor, which I dropped so I wouldn't drift. I had water and food for the day, because I always packed more than I needed. I had life jackets and flares. I wasn't in immediate danger. The sea state was calm, but I was stuck, and nobody knew exactly where I was. I told my dad I was going fishing that morning, but I didn't tell him specifically where. He probably assumed I was in my usual spots closer to shore. If I didn't come home by dark, he'd start worrying. But that was hours away. I sat there for about an hour, trying the phone periodically. The current was slowly pushing me northeast despite the anchor. I wasn't worried about it at first, but after a while I noticed I was getting closer to the island with the lighthouse. The anchor wasn't grabbing well. The bottom out here was mostly rock, and my lightweight Danforth anchor wasn't designed for rock. It was skipping along. By early afternoon, I had drifted close enough to the island that I could see details I'd never noticed from far away. The lighthouse was in worse shape than I'd thought. The upper portion of the tower was partially collapsed. The attached buildings at the base were roofless and overgrown. The rocks around the island were sharp and dark, slick with algae. The water between me and the island was getting shallower. I could see the bottom in places, dark rocks just below the surface. I realized I was going to hit the reef if I didn't do something. I pulled the anchor and tried to paddle with the small emergency oar I kept on board. But a 19-foot boat loaded with fishing gear doesn't move well with one oar. The current was winning. I watched as the water beneath me got shallower and shallower. Then I felt the first scrape. The hull touched rock and made a sound that every boater dreads, a grinding screech that vibrates through your entire body. I tried to push off with the oar, but the current kept pressing me forward. Another scrape, then a solid crunch, and the boat lurched to a stop. I was grounded on the reef, about 60 yards from the island shore. The hull was wedged between two submerged rocks. I checked for leaks, nothing immediate, but the fiberglass was cracked in at least one spot below the waterline. Water was seeping in slowly. I had a bilge pump and it was handling the flow, but I knew it was going to get worse as the tide changed. I did the math in my head. High tide was going to be around 8 p.m. It was maybe 2 in the afternoon. If the tide came up enough to float me off these rocks, I might be able to drift free. But if the hull damage was bad enough, I might sink when I floated free. Or the rising water might overwhelm the bilge pump before I floated at all. Neither option was great. I made a decision. I would swim to the island and wait there. Higher ground, visible to passing boats. I could wave someone down eventually. I could try my phone from a higher elevation. It was better than sitting in a slowly sinking boat. The swim was about 60 yards through cold water over sharp rocks. I wore my life jacket and my shoes. I put my phone in a sandwich bag from my cooler, not exactly a waterproof case, but better than nothing. I went over the side and immediately felt the cold. September in the Atlantic off North Carolina isn't freezing, but it's not warm either. The rocks beneath me were slippery and uneven. I half swam, half climbed my way toward shore. I cut my shin on something. My hands were scraped up by the time I pulled myself onto the rocks at the island's edge. But I made it. I climbed up the rocks to the flat area at the center of the island. The vegetation was scrubby and thick. Seagrass, some low bushes, a few twisted, wind-battered trees that barely qualified as trees. The lighthouse sat at the highest point, which was maybe 30 feet above sea level. Not much, but enough to survey the water in all directions. I checked my phone. The sandwich bag had mostly worked. A little moisture on the screen, but it was functional. Still barely 1 bar of signal. I tried calling my dad again. It rang twice and dropped. I tried texting. The text sat there trying to send with that spinning wheel that never completes. I walked around trying to find a spot with better signal. Near the lighthouse, I got 2 bars for a moment. I tried calling again and got through. My dad answered and I talked fast. I told him my engine died, my boat was on the reef by the lighthouse island, and I needed a tow out here as soon as possible. He said he'd head out in his boat and bring help. He said hold tight. He'd be there within an hour and a half. The call dropped again, but I was pretty sure he heard enough. Relief washed over me. An hour and a half. I could wait an hour and a half. I sat down on a rock near the lighthouse and caught my breath. That's when I started looking around more carefully, and that's when things started to not add up. The first thing I noticed was the rope. There was a length of marine rope, maybe 30 feet of it, coiled neatly at the base of the lighthouse. It wasn't old and weathered like everything else on this island. It was relatively new, clean, the kind of white braided nylon you'd buy from West Marine. I wouldn't have thought much of it except for how it was coiled, perfectly, not tangled or thrown aside. Someone had carefully coiled this rope and placed it here recently. The second thing was the fire ring. On the lee side of the lighthouse, sheltered from the wind, there was a circle of rocks with ash inside. Not ancient ash either. This was recent. There were partially burned pieces of wood and what looked like charred fabric. I picked up a piece of the fabric with a stick. It was thick material, like denim, a piece of clothing that someone had burned. The third thing was the smell. As I walked around to the back side of the lighthouse, the seaward side facing away from the mainland, I noticed a smell, sweet and wrong. Not quite rot, but something adjacent to it. Chemical almost, like someone had tried to cover up a bad smell with something worse. I found the source about 15 feet from the base of the lighthouse. It was a patch of disturbed earth, in a place where there was almost no soil, just rock and thin scrub. Someone had gathered enough dirt and rocks to create a mound, maybe 3 feet by 5 feet, covered with loose stones. The smell was coming from under it. I'm going to be honest with you. I knew what it looked like. I knew what that size and shape of a mound suggested. I knew what that smell probably meant. And I stood there with my heart hammering in my chest, trying very hard to come up with any other explanation. An animal. A dead seal or something that someone had buried. That was possible. People bury dead animals sometimes. But out here? On a rocky island that nobody visits? Who would come here to bury a dead animal? I backed away from the mound and kept exploring because apparently I have no survival instinct whatsoever. The backside of the lighthouse had a rusted metal door that was partially open. The inside of the tower was gutted, no stairs remaining, just the hollow cylinder going up with daylight coming through the collapsed upper portion. But at ground level, against the wall, there were more signs of recent human presence. Empty water bottles, a tarp folded up, more rope, and scratches on the interior wall, not graffiti, not words or pictures, just scratches, like someone had dragged something sharp across the concrete wall over and over. Some of them were high, near eye level. Some were low, near the floor. They covered an entire section of wall, maybe 6 feet wide. I stepped back outside into the daylight. The sky was still clear, the water was still calm. From the island I could see the mainland coast, a thin, dark line on the horizon. No boats were visible anywhere. I sat back down on the rock where I'd had phone signal before. I tried calling my dad again. No signal now. The 2 bars were gone. I tried different spots on the island. Nothing. The signal that had been there 20 minutes ago had disappeared entirely. It occurred to me that I was now on an island with a disturbed mound that smelled like death, evidence of recent human activity and no way to communicate with anyone. My dad was hopefully on his way. "An hour and a half," he said. "Probably less now. I just had to wait." I positioned myself on the highest point of the island near the lighthouse, where I would be visible from the water. I sat facing the mainland. I checked my phone compulsively even though it had no signal. The time moved slowly. I kept looking at the mound. I couldn't help it. It was in my peripheral vision and my eyes kept drifting to it. The smell came in waves depending on the wind direction. I tried to focus on the water, looking for boats, looking for my dad's center console with its distinctive blue hull, looking for anyone. About 30 minutes after my phone call, I noticed something in the water that made me very uncomfortable. There was a boat approaching the island, but it wasn't coming from the mainland side. It was coming from the south, from further out to sea, and it wasn't my dad's blue center console. It was a dark-hulled boat, maybe 25 feet, moving slowly, intentionally, heading directly toward the island, toward me. I watched the boat approach with a knot forming in my stomach. On one hand, a boat meant rescue. Someone who could give me a ride back to the mainland or at least relay a message on their radio. On the other hand, everything I'd found on this island was screaming at me that whoever visited this place regularly was not someone I wanted to meet. The boat was moving slowly, maybe 5 knots, picking its way through the water carefully. Whoever was driving it knew about the reef. They were navigating a specific path, angling around the south side of the island where the rocks were less dense. They knew exactly how to approach this place. That meant they'd done it before. I stood up from my rock and made a decision that I'm still not sure was right or wrong. I moved behind the lighthouse, out of sight from the approaching boat. I crouched down behind the crumbling concrete wall on the seaward side and waited. I could hear the boat's engine now, a low rumble getting closer. Then the engine cut to idle. Then it stopped entirely. I heard the sound of an anchor chain running out. Then silence except for the waves and wind. I stayed perfectly still. I was listening for footsteps on rock, for a dinghy being lowered, for any indication of what was happening. For about 2 minutes, nothing. Then I heard a splash, not a big one, like someone stepping into shallow water. Then the unmistakable sound of feet on wet rock. Someone had waded ashore, one person, based on the single set of footfalls. The steps were deliberate and unhurried. This person was comfortable here. They knew the terrain. I pressed myself against the lighthouse wall. The footsteps got closer. They were coming around the lee side of the lighthouse, near the fire ring. I heard them stop. Then I heard a sound that I can only describe as a grunt of effort, like someone picking up something heavy, then dragging. Something was being dragged across rock. The scraping sound was awful. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Then the footsteps again, coming around the lighthouse, getting closer to where I was hiding. I looked around frantically for anywhere better to hide. There was nothing, just low scrub and open rock. If this person walked around the full perimeter of the lighthouse, they would see me. I made a split-second decision and moved. I went through the rusted metal door into the lighthouse interior. The hollow tower was dim inside, lit only by the daylight coming through the collapsed upper section. I pressed myself against the wall just inside the door, behind where the door would be if it were fully open. The footsteps were right outside now. They stopped. I could hear breathing, not heavy or labored, just calm, steady breathing. The person was standing just outside the door. I held my breath. Every muscle in my body was locked. My phone was in my hand, and I was gripping it so hard the case was creaking. I could feel my heartbeat in my teeth. The person stood there for what felt like forever. In reality, it was probably 20 seconds. Then the footsteps resumed. They walked away from the door, back toward the front of the lighthouse. I exhaled silently and stayed frozen against the wall. The footsteps receded. I heard more sounds of effort, another dragging sound. Then footsteps on rock, heading away, getting fainter. Then a splash, the sound of someone wading back out. A long pause, then the anchor chain, then the engine starting. The engine revved and the sound began to move away, getting quieter. I waited another 5 minutes before I moved. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I stepped out of the lighthouse and looked toward the water. The dark-hulled boat was heading south again, moving away from the island at a steady pace. I watched it until it was just a speck on the water. Then I walked around to the front of the lighthouse and looked at the area near the fire ring. Something had changed. There was a new shape on the ground near the fire ring that hadn't been there before. It was covered with the blue tarp that had been inside the lighthouse. The tarp was draped over something roughly the size of a large duffel bag, maybe 4 feet long, oblong. I didn't touch it. I didn't lift the tarp. I didn't need to. I already knew I didn't want to see what was under it. But my eyes went to the mound again, the disturbed earth mound with the rocks on top, and the size of the tarp-covered shape compared to the size of the mound. They were similar. Very similar. My brain was putting together a picture that I desperately didn't want to see complete. The new rope, the fire ring with burned clothing, the scratches on the walls, the mound, and now a delivery. Someone had just delivered something to this island. I needed to get off this rock immediately. I walked to the point of the island facing the mainland and just stood there, watching the water. I was shaking, not from cold, from adrenaline and fear and the overwhelming need to be somewhere else. I checked my phone. Still no signal. I couldn't even call 911. I was trapped on this island with whatever was under that tarp, waiting for my dad, with absolutely no guarantee that the person in the dark boat wouldn't come back. I scanned the water constantly, looking north toward the mainland, looking south in case the dark boat was returning. The minutes crawled. 15 minutes, 20, 30. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, I saw a boat coming from the north. The mainland direction, blue hull, my dad's center console. I've never felt relief like that in my life. I scrambled down to the waterline and started waving my arms. He saw me. I could see him adjust course and head straight for the island. He approached carefully from the north side, different from where the dark boat had come. He got as close as he could and shouted at me to swim out to him. The gap was about 40 yards. I went into the water without hesitation. I swam harder than I've ever swum in my life. He pulled me aboard, and before he could even ask if I was okay, I told him we needed to leave right now and call the Coast Guard. He looked at me like I was crazy, but he trusted my tone. He got on the radio immediately. I told him everything while we headed back toward the mainland. The mound, the tarp, the dark boat. He relayed what he could to the Coast Guard while I sat in the bow, shivering and watching the island shrink behind us. Coast Guard and local law enforcement went to the island the next day. I was there at the dock when they came back. They confirmed the mound, they confirmed the tarp. I was told very little about what was found because it became an active investigation. But I was interviewed 3 times, once by Coast Guard, once by local police, and once by what I think were federal agents, though they never explicitly said that. They asked me to describe the boat in every detail I could remember. Dark hull, maybe 25 feet. I couldn't remember the make. I didn't see a name or registration numbers. They asked about the person. I never saw them, only heard them. One set of footsteps, a grunt of effort, calm breathing. That's all I had. They asked if I would recognize the sound of the engine if I heard it again. Honestly, I don't know, maybe. They told me the investigation was ongoing and asked me not to talk about it publicly. I followed that request for a few years, but nothing ever came of it as far as I know. No arrests were publicized. No missing persons cases in my area were closed. I checked the news obsessively for months and found nothing. My boat was a total loss. The hull was cracked badly enough that it wasn't worth repairing. Insurance covered some of it, but not all. I bought a new boat the following year, but I never went near that island again. I barely went offshore at all for the first several months. The fishing had been a source of peace for me my entire life, and suddenly, the open water felt different. It felt like a place where bad things happened in the space between, where people can see. I think about that island more than I should. I think about the tally marks on the wall and whether they corresponded to the number of mounds that might be on that island that I didn't find because I didn't explore thoroughly enough. I think about the scratches on the wall and what made them and from what position a person would have to be in to scratch at both eye level and near the floor. I think about the burned clothing in the fire ring. I think about the new rope. I think about the dragging sound. Mostly I think about the breathing outside the door, that calm, steady breathing of someone who was completely relaxed on an island where terrible things were clearly happening. That's what scares me the most. Not that I was close to a bad person, but that the bad person was so completely at ease, like this was routine for them, like this was just a Wednesday. I never found out what was under the tarp. Part of me is glad. But a bigger part of me carries this weight of knowing I was there and saw evidence and the person was never caught, at least not that I know of. Someone is still out there with a dark-hulled boat, and they know how to navigate that reef. And they know that island is far enough from shore that nobody hears anything. That knowledge lives in me now, and I can't get it out. Every time I see a boat I don't recognize heading out to sea, part of me wonders where it's going and what it's carrying. I'll never think about the ocean the same way again. This last story is different from the others because it didn't happen to just me. It happened to 4 of us, and the reason I'm the one telling it is because I'm the only one who will talk about it. The other 3 refuse to discuss it. One of them, my friend Marcus, hasn't spoken to me in over a year, partially because I keep bringing it up, and he told me he can't handle hearing about it anymore. He said it makes him feel like he's losing his mind. I get that, I do, but I can't stop thinking about it, and I need to put it somewhere. So here it is. This happened 3 years ago. I was 26. My friends Marcus, Devin, and Trish were all around the same age. We'd been close since college. The kind of friend group that does everything together and has too many inside jokes that make other people uncomfortable. We were hanging out at Devin's apartment one Friday night in October. We were drinking, talking about nothing important, when Devin brought up the Lighthouse. He'd heard about it from a coworker. There was this lake about 2 hours north of where we lived. A real lake, not a reservoir, fairly large. And on the lake, There was a small island that you could see from the public beach on the south shore. On that island was a lighthouse. According to Devon's co-worker, the lighthouse was built in the 1890s, back when the lake had a lot of commercial shipping traffic. It had been abandoned since the 1930s when the shipping routes changed and the lake traffic died off. The co-worker said it was haunted. Of course, every old building is supposedly haunted according to someone, but this one apparently had a specific story attached to it. Supposedly, a keeper went insane in the winter of 1924 and killed his family before drowning himself in the lake. The lighthouse was decommissioned shortly after, and the island was abandoned. Nobody owned it now. It just sat there, state property technically, with no one maintaining it. The co-worker told Devon that local teenagers would sometimes take boats out to the island on dares, spend the night in the lighthouse. Most of them came back with boring stories about cold and boredom. But a few supposedly came back shaken, said they heard things, voices on the water, their own names being called. The obvious response from our group was that we had to go. We were 26, which is old enough to know better and young enough to do it anyway. Trish was the most hesitant. She didn't like the water at night. She was a strong swimmer, but something about dark water freaked her out. I told her it would be fine. The island was maybe 200 yards from the south shore. You could practically swim there. We'd take a boat, hang out for a few hours, maybe stay until midnight or 1 a.m., and come back. No big deal. Devon found a small aluminum rowboat at a rental place near the lake. He booked it for the weekend. We drove up Saturday afternoon and got a motel near the lake. We spent the day hiking around the lake's south shore and scoping out the island from a distance. You could see the lighthouse clearly. It was shorter than I expected, maybe 40 feet tall, dark stone construction. No glass remaining in the upper lantern room, just an empty frame at the top. The attached buildings at the base had partially collapsed. Even from 200 yards away, it looked genuinely decrepit, unwelcoming. The island itself was small, maybe 3 acres, mostly rock and sparse trees. We waited until the sunset to head out. Around 7:30, the 4 of us loaded into the aluminum rowboat with backpacks containing flashlights, snacks, water, a Bluetooth speaker, and a bottle of whiskey. Devon and Marcus rowed while Trish and I navigated from the bow. The crossing took about 10 minutes. The lake was calm. The water was dark and cold. As we got closer to the island, the air temperature dropped noticeably, like crossing a boundary. One second it was a cool autumn evening. The next it felt like we'd moved into a different season entirely. The landing was easy enough. We pulled the boat up onto a flat section of rock and tied it to a tree stump. We turned on our flashlights and started up the rocky slope toward the lighthouse. The island was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Most places at night have some ambient sound, crickets, frogs, wind through leaves. This island was just quiet. The only sound was our footsteps and the faint lapping of water against rock behind us. The lighthouse up close was smaller and sadder than I expected. The door at the base was gone, just an open archway. Inside was damp and cold with a dirt floor. The spiral staircase was still intact, rusted but seemingly solid. The walls were covered in graffiti from decades of teenagers who'd come before us. Names, dates, crude drawings, the usual. We explored the whole thing in about 15 minutes, climbed to the top, which gave us a 360-degree view of the dark lake and the distant shorelights. It was actually cool. Once the initial exploration was done, we settled in the ground floor room. Devon put on music. Marcus poured whiskey into plastic cups. We sat in a circle on the dirt floor with our flashlights pointed at the ceiling for ambient light and just talked. The vibe was good. Spooky setting, good friends, a little alcohol. The kind of night you remember fondly. For the first 2 hours, nothing unusual happened. We laughed, we drank, we told stories. Trish relaxed and admitted she was actually having fun. Devon kept making jokes about the ghost keeper trying to scare us, but nobody was actually scared. It felt exactly like what it was. 4 friends sitting in an old building being silly. It was around 11:30 when things changed. The first thing was the speaker. It cut out mid-song. Not like the battery died, because the Bluetooth light was still on. It just went silent. Devon picked it up and checked it. The phone was still connected and showing the song playing, but no sound was coming out. He disconnected and reconnected. Nothing. Turned the speaker off and back on, still nothing. He shrugged and said the speaker was cheap garbage and put it away. Without music. The silence of the island became very present. We all noticed it at the same time. Nobody said anything about it immediately, but I could feel the energy shift. The conversation got quieter. The jokes stopped. We were all suddenly very aware of how quiet it was outside these walls. Then Marcus asked if anyone else heard that. We all froze and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then, very faintly, from somewhere outside, I heard what sounded like a voice. Not words exactly, just the cadence of a human voice carrying across water, low and indistinct, like someone talking on the far shore and the sound traveling over the lake. I told Marcus it was probably people on the mainland. Sound carries over water really well at night, especially on a calm lake. He nodded. Made sense. We all accepted that explanation because it was easy and logical and let us keep feeling safe. About 15 minutes later, Trish heard it too. She grabbed my arm, same way Rachel grabbed her boyfriend's arm in the earlier story, and said she heard someone calling. I listened again. This time I could make it out more clearly. It was definitely a voice, and it was definitely coming from the water, not the mainland. From somewhere on the lake between us and the shore. It was too far away to make out words, but the rhythm of it sounded like someone calling out, calling to someone. Devin suggested it was another boat on the lake. Maybe some late-night fisherman or other kids doing what we were doing. That made sense. October was a popular time for campfires and late-night lake activities. I accepted that. Then the voice got clearer, and I felt my stomach drop into my shoes, because the voice was calling a name, my name. I couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from, somewhere out on the water, maybe 50 or 100 yards from shore. But it was unmistakably my name, clear as day, called out in a tone that sounded concerned, like someone looking for me, like someone worried about me. The exact way your mom calls your name when you're a kid and you're out past dark and she's worried, that exact inflection. I looked at the others. Marcus was staring at me with his mouth slightly open. He'd heard it too. Devin was standing now, flashlight pointed at the archway, even though you couldn't see the water from inside. Trish had her hands over her mouth. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Devin said it was probably someone messing with us, some locals who saw us launch the boat and were having fun at our expense. They could have looked us up, found our names somehow. It was a stretch, but we wanted to believe it. We wanted any explanation. Then we heard it again, but this time it wasn't my name. It was Marcus's name, same tone, same concerned, searching inflection, coming from the water. Marcus stood up so fast he knocked over his cup. He said he wanted to leave. Right now, I agreed. Devin agreed. Trish was already by the archway with her flashlight aimed down the slope toward where we'd left the boat. We packed up quickly, shoved everything into backpacks with no regard for organization, flashlights sweeping around nervously. The voice on the water had gone quiet. We walked down the slope toward the water's edge. Our 4 flashlight beams bounced ahead of us, illuminating the rocky ground and the sparse trees and the dark water beyond. Trish reached the water's edge first. She stopped. Then she turned around and looked at us, and the expression on her face was one that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The boat was gone. I pushed past her and looked for myself. The stump we'd tied it to was there. The rope was still tied to the stump. But the end of the rope that had been tied to the boat's bow cleat was frayed, like it had been cut. Not untied. Cut. I pulled the rope up out of the water and looked at the end. Clean, frayed fibers. Somebody had cut our boat loose. We all started talking at once. Marcus was almost shouting. Devin was scanning the water with his flashlight. Trish was just saying, "No, no, no," over and over. I was trying to think logically through the panic. The boat was aluminum. It would float even if it drifted. I scanned the water with my flashlight. I couldn't see it anywhere. A boat doesn't disappear in calm water in a few hours. It should have been floating within visible distance. but the lake was black and still and empty as far as my light could reach. Then we heard it again, from the water. This time, it said Devon's name. Devon's full name, first and last, in a voice that sounded exactly like Devon's mother. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds crazy, but I know Devon's mother. I've known her for years. I've eaten at her table dozens of times. I know what she sounds like. And that voice on the water sounded exactly like her. Devon didn't react the way I expected. He didn't panic. He went very still and very quiet. He pointed his flashlight out over the water in the direction the voice came from. He stared into the darkness. Then he took a step toward the water. Just one step. Marcus grabbed his arm and pulled him back. He said, "Don't, just don't." We stood there on the rocks at the water's edge, 4 flashlights pointed out over the lake, listening. The voice came again. This time, it was Trish's name, in a voice that sounded so much like her older sister that Trish started crying, not loud crying, silent tears streaming down her face while she stared at the water. I want to be clear about something. We were not drunk. We'd each had maybe 2 drinks over 3 hours. We were cold and scared and fully sober. Whatever was happening was not alcohol-induced. And it wasn't one voice mimicking different people. Each name came in a different voice, a voice specific to the person being called, a voice that each of us recognized, a voice of someone we loved. They were calling us toward the water. I made a decision in that moment that I think saved us. I told everyone to turn off their flashlights. I don't know why I thought of it. Maybe I thought that whatever was out there was tracking our lights. Maybe I thought that if we couldn't see the water, we wouldn't be tempted to walk toward it. Maybe I just needed to do something, anything, that felt like taking control of the situation. Everyone turned off their lights. The darkness was absolute. No moon that night. The cloud cover had rolled in at some point without us noticing. The only light was a faint glow from the mainland shore across the lake, tiny pinpricks of distant houses and streetlights. I told everyone to move away from the water, back up the slope, back toward the lighthouse. Nobody argued. We fumbled our way up the rocks in the dark, holding on to each other. Trish had my jacket in her fist. I had Marcus's backpack strap. Devon was behind us somewhere. I could hear his breathing. We made it back to the lighthouse and went inside. I told everyone to sit down against the far wall, the wall furthest from the archway and the water. We sat there in the dark. Nobody turned on a flashlight. From inside the lighthouse, with the thick stone walls around us, the sound from the water was muffled, but not gone. We could still hear it, faintly, like it was getting closer. The voices took turns. My name, Marcus's name, Devon's name, Trish's name, each in that familiar, loving voice, each with that concerned inflection, like our loved ones were standing in the water, worried about us, wanting us to come to them. Marcus whispered that he wanted to call back. He said it sounded so much like his grandmother who had passed away 2 years before. He said he knew it wasn't her. He knew it couldn't be her. But the voice was perfect. Every inflection, every warmth in her tone. He said it hurt to not answer. I told him not to answer. I told him that whatever this was, it wanted us in the water. Every instinct I had was screaming that responding would make it worse, that engaging with it in any way would give it something it needed. So we sat there, 4 adults huddled against a stone wall in the dark on a tiny island, listening to voices that shouldn't exist call our names from the black water of a lake in October. The voices continued for hours. I'm not exaggerating. Hours. They would go quiet for stretches of maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and we would start to relax, start to think it was over. Then they would start again. Sometimes just one name, sometimes all 4 in sequence. The tone never changed, never became angry or threatening. Always that same gentle, concerned calling, like someone looking for a lost child. That consistency was somehow the worst part. If the voices had been threatening or scary in an obvious way, I think it would have been easier. But they sounded like love. They sounded like being wanted and missed and searched for. And every single time I heard my name in my mother's voice, some deep, primitive part of my brain wanted to answer, wanted to go to the water, wanted to go home, I had to fight that impulse every single time. Sometime around 3 in the morning, Marcus said he saw something. He had turned his head toward the archway, and he said there was something in the water that he could just barely make out. I told him not to look. He said it looked like a person, standing in the shallows, maybe 20 feet from the shore, just standing in the water up to their waist, not moving. I didn't look. I don't know why I made that choice, but I'm glad I did. Devin looked. He looked, and then he looked away very quickly and pressed his back harder against the wall. He didn't say what he saw. He has never told me what he saw. When I ask, he changes the subject or just goes quiet. Trish kept her eyes closed the entire night. From the moment we sat down against that wall until the sun came up, she never opened her eyes. She told me later that she thought if she saw whatever was calling to us, she wouldn't be able to resist it. She thought seeing it would break something in her that was currently holding firm. I think she might have been right. We sat there through the entire night, the longest night of my life. The voices would come and go, sometimes from one direction, sometimes from another, sometimes close, sometimes far away. Once, and this is the part that I can't think about without feeling physically ill, the voice came from above us. From inside the lighthouse tower, "My name!" called softly in my mother's voice, coming from somewhere up the spiral staircase. I gripped the stones beneath me, and I did not move, and I did not answer, and I did not look up. The first gray light of dawn appeared around 5:30. The voices had stopped about 20 minutes before. The silence felt fragile, like it could break at any moment. But as the light grew stronger, something in the air shifted. The weight lifted. I can't describe it better than that. The island felt lighter. The water sounds returned to normal, waves and wind and distant birds. Regular morning sounds. I was the first one to stand up. My legs were cramped and shaking from sitting in the same position for over 6 hours. I walked to the archway and looked out. The lake was gray and calm in the early morning light. Empty. No figures in the water, no boat. Nothing unusual at all, just a lake. I looked down toward where we'd tied the boat. The rope was still hanging from the stump, trailing into the water, no boat attached. I told the others it was morning, that we needed to figure out how to get off this island. Marcus stood up and walked to the archway without saying a word. He looked out at the water for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone. He had signal. It was weak, but it was there. He called 911 and told them we were stranded on an island in the lake and our boat was gone. He didn't mention the voices. He didn't mention anything else, just that our boat drifted away and we needed rescue. A boat from the Parks Department came out about 45 minutes later. 2 parks officers, young guys, routine rescue. They made small talk on the ride back, asked if we'd stayed on the island all night. We said yes. They said we weren't the first. Said it happened a few times a year, people going out there and getting stranded when their boats came loose. They said the lake had weird currents near the island that pulled at boats. I asked if other people reported anything unusual about the island. One of the officers paused for a beat and then said, "People report a lot of things." He left it at that. Back on shore, we loaded up the car in silence. The drive home was 2 hours of almost total quiet. Nobody wanted to talk about it, not yet. Not while it was still so raw. That was 3 years ago. In those 3 years, this is what I know for certain. 1, the voices were real. All 4 of us heard them. We've confirmed with each other that we all heard the same things, our names in the voices of people we loved. This was not a shared hallucination or a drunken misremembering. 2, the boat was cut loose. The rope was cut, not untied, not worn through. Cut. Someone or something cut our boat free while we were in the lighthouse. 3, the voices knew our names, and they knew which voices to use. They called Marcus in his dead grandmother's voice. They called me in my mother's voice. They called Devin in his mother's voice. They called Trish in her sister's voice. These are not things that a prankster could know. These are deeply personal, specific choices. 4. Devin saw something in the water that he refuses to describe, and whatever he saw changed him. He's not the same person he was before that night. He's quieter, more closed off. He stopped coming to group gatherings. When we do see him, he doesn't stay long and he doesn't make eye contact the way he used to. Marcus won't talk about it at all. Like I said, he stopped speaking to me partially because I kept trying to process it by talking about it. He told me the last time we spoke that every time he hears his grandmother's voice in his memory, the real memory of her, it's contaminated now. He can't hear her voice in his mind without it bleeding into what he heard on the water that night. He said it took something from him that he can't get back. The real memory of her voice is tangled up with whatever used it. Trish is the most functional of all of us. She moved to another state about a year after it happened. She told me before she left that she's fine as long as she's not near water. Any water. She said she went to a lake with a boyfriend once, months after the island, and the moment she heard water lapping against a shore, she heard her name. Just once. Faint. In her sister's voice. She left immediately and she doesn't go near lakes anymore. As for me, I'm okay, mostly. I sleep fine most nights. I go about my life. But I have this thing now where I can't be near open water after dark. Pools are fine. Bathtubs are fine. But lakes, oceans, rivers at night? No, I can't do it. I was at a beach bonfire last summer, and the moment the sun went down completely and the water turned black, I heard something. I'm not sure if it was real or if my brain manufactured it from trauma, but I heard the faintest whisper of my name from somewhere over the water in my mother's voice. I left, drove home at 11 p.m. without saying goodbye to anyone. I know people have theories about what we experienced. I've read about infrasound from lake seabeds. I've read about auditory hallucinations caused by cold exposure and sleep deprivation. I've read about how the brain can manufacture familiar voices under stress, pulling from memory to create phantom sounds. Maybe one of those explanations is correct. I genuinely hope one of them is, because the alternative is that something lives in that lake, something that knows your name and knows the voice of the person you love most, something that calls you to the water with love in its voice and waits for you to come. And I think about all the people over the years who've taken boats to that island on a dare. Teenagers and college kids and drunk adults who thought it would be fun. I think about the parks officers saying our boat wasn't the first to come loose. I think about how many of those people might have heard their name called. And I think about how many of them might have answered, because I almost did. In those dark hours, sitting against that wall, hearing my mother's voice calling for me with such genuine worry and love, I almost answered. I almost went to the water. I almost let whatever it was have me. And that's the thing that keeps me up at night. Not the fear of it happening again, not the mystery of what it was, just the knowledge that I was that close, that the thing keeping me alive was nothing more than stubbornness and the fact that my friends were there to anchor me. If I'd been alone on that island, I don't think I'd be here telling this story. The voices would have worn me down eventually. Love always does. I don't go to that lake anymore. I don't go to any lake at night. And when my mom calls me on the phone, there's this split second before I answer where I hesitate, just for a moment. Because some part of me needs to confirm that the call is coming from her phone and not from somewhere else, not from somewhere dark and still and endlessly patient. That hesitation is new. It wasn't there before the island. And I don't think it'll ever go away. Some experiences leave a mark that doesn't fade. They just become part of you. A new lens you see the world through that you can never take off. The island gave me that lens. And through it, every body of water at night looks like it's waiting. Looks like it's listening. Looks like it knows my name. If you ever hear about a lighthouse on a lake and someone dares you to spend the night, don't. I don't care how brave you are. I don't care how skeptical you are. Don't. Because whatever is out there in that water, it doesn't care about your bravery or your skepticism. It just needs you to be close enough to hear it. And once you hear it, once you hear someone you love calling your name from the dark water, you'll understand what I mean when I say that the hardest thing I've ever done was not answer. Harder than anything before or since. Because it sounded like home. And every single part of me wanted to go.